Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Ranch in Taos, Mexico, working on oil painting alchemical light. Alright, this evening I'm just going to do some real simple detailing on the mermaid. We're going to put an aura, a bright pink aura around her, and if there's time I'm going to set up some paint to do a bright blue aura around the dog man, but one thing at a time.
That's still in a plan. Other Israeli commentators have also concluded that
Be careful because all the shadow paint from the last session is still wet. So I'm going to go very slowly with this and just get a nice bright thin layer of blended magenta and titanium white.
Sharon's old plan of installing a Maronite kingdom, the goal that goes back to Ben Gurion and others. So yeah, maybe. I don't know. I kind of doubt it because it's just off. But I mean, you could imagine it in 1982. You could imagine you could get away with it, and in fact, they almost did. But this time, it's pretty hard to imagine. For one thing, the Maronites are split. One large segment, Michel Aoun, General Aoun, is linked more or less to Hezbollah, and they're nowhere near the power they had back in '82 when they had a big armed militia that Israel was supporting and so on.
Talk about the Israeli military. It has a vaunted reputation for performance in past wars. Siddharth Varadarajan, writing in The Hindu on August 14th, had this comment to make. More than 30 years of enforcing a military occupation and fighting children and poorly equipped guerrillas have clearly taken their toll on the ability of the legendary Israeli army to fight a full-fledged war.
Well, again, I'm no big military expert, but I don't quite agree with that. I think that if Israel was to have a war with, say, Syria, it wouldn't be a 6-day war, it would probably be a 15-minute war. So yes, that kind of war I think they can still fight. What they have not been able to fight, and here Hezbollah is unique, is a serious guerrilla war. The first time. They are now fighting a guerrilla movement deeply entrenched in the population, and from a military point of view, pretty sophisticated. In fact, if you read the Israeli press, which I've been doing regularly, they're shocked. The military is shocked. They thought, first of all, that the chief of staff, Dan Khalutz, is the former Air Force chief, and Uri Avneri pointed out, he's a pretty acute commentator, he pointed out recently that Dan Khalutz, he said, is the real ruler of Israel, and he sees the world through a bomb sight. So he's, we're familiar with that from U.S. history. You can just bomb everything to oblivion, and it's fine. Well, it often doesn't work. It didn't work this time. They bombed and bombed, they didn't get anywhere. They didn't want to send in ground troops because they know they're going to be fighting a guerrilla war, the same kind that drove them out in the first place. And when they went in, they had tough fighting everywhere. The Hezbollah forces were behind them, in front of them. It was kind of like fighting what the U.S. calls the Viet Cong, the propaganda term. The National Liberation Front forces in South Vietnam were just population. And that's a tough war. Not only is it tough in your own forces, but it's a war against the population, and we know what that means. So they didn't want to send in ground troops. They finally did because they couldn't get anywhere, and they had hard fighting, and they had to, they probably killed 1,000 Lebanese, and they destroyed a large part of the country. That's the easy part, not just Hezbollah. I mean, when they say they're attacking Hezbollah targets, that means they're attacking the civilian society, like the southern Beirut, where actually I was a couple of months ago. It's a city. It's a poor city. And yes, that's a Hezbollah target. Most of the population are Shiites, support Hezbollah, or else Amal, which is a close ally with about the same programs. So yeah, you want to attack Hezbollah, you have to attack the civilian society. I mean, you can also get, paranoid fanatics, like our friend over in the Harvard Law School, who wrote that, he wrote an article which I don't think you could find an analog for, you'd have to look in the Nazi archives to find something like it. He said 87% of Lebanese support Hezbollah resistance, so therefore all Lebanese are legitimate targets. So if anybody supports resistance to the holy state, they're a legitimate target for destruction. try to find an analog for that. I've been thinking, I haven't been able to find one. But yeah, so way out at the hysterical extreme, you get that view. And from there on over, it's the general, you get to the moderates who say, well, the attack on the civilian society is disproportionate. And in fact, it's not disproportionate, it's outrageous. And we know that they believe that. Just imagine that anybody had suggested after, say, the kidnapping of the Muammar brothers on June 24th, or Israel's long history of kidnapping and abducting Lebanese, suppose anyone had suggested destroying half of Israel. I mean, you'd think it's a revival of Nazism. Okay, is this any different? Yeah, okay, it's not. So the word disproportionate is not in place, and certainly not the extremist fanatics. But it's reasonably clear what happened, and nobody comes out pure as driven snow. But our problem we should be concerned with is the United States. After all, that's us. That's what we're doing.
That Harvard law professor is Alan Dershowitz. Well, what does this war do to the American project in Lebanon for a Cedar Revolution after the assassination of the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri on February 14, 2005? There were mass street demonstrations. Syria left the country, and 1559 was passed, and there was going to be a new era in Lebanon. It seems almost that the Israeli destruction of key aspects of the Lebanese state, I mean, the ability to provide services, transport and healthcare, etc., have been compromised and weakened.
Well, first of all, after the Cedar Revolution, antagonism toward and suspicion of the United States in Lebanon was higher than of Syria. So Bush would like to take credit for the Cedar Revolution, but that's not the Lebanese view. There were elements in Lebanon, like Willie Jumblatt, for example, who I mentioned, who are very, at times, varies. They're opportunistic politicians, but at times have been supportive of the United States. Shibli Malat certainly is the other person I mentioned. And in the March 14th coalition, there are elements like that, but many are not. Again, Hezbollah is just integrated into the society, and they're not the only ones. I mean, Amal, the other major Shiite organization, has similar stands. So the Bush program we can basically forget about. This was a Lebanese program. France and the United States, again, for their own cynical reasons, for once didn't impede a move towards democracy, but that's about the most you can say. And the democracy that emerges has to be of the kind that is subordinated to U.S. interests. We can see that very clearly by the U.S. reaction to the election of Hamas. It's a very free election. Everyone agreed. Vote the wrong way, okay, you strangle them. Punish the population. That's standard operating procedure, once again. So whatever the project, they undoubtedly didn't want Lebanon to reconstruct as a kind of commercial, financial center society, rebuild, run for the wealthy, poor Shiites in South Beirut and South Lebanon. The government did essentially nothing for them, which is one of the reasons why Hezbollah became so powerful. It was not its military forces, it was providing social services. It was the government. It was providing health, educational services, support, and so on. And like other Islamic fundamentalist movements, that's the basis for its enormous popular support. The United States certainly didn't intend to have a democracy of the kind that's going to provide services for the population. I mean, is that the intent of the Bush administration right here, for example? I mean, we don't have to talk about that. But whatever the project may have been, it's now in ruins. The United States, the U.S.-Israeli invasion has created enormous popularity for Hezbollah. It's almost undoubtedly created a new generation of jihadi terrorists all over the Arab world, Muslim worlds probably. Hezbollah has, after all, achieved something that none of the Arab states achieved. It deterred an Israeli invasion. Actually, Rami Khouri, who, is maybe the most distinguished journalist in the Arab world, a very intelligent person, yet one of the editors of the Daily Star in Lebanon, He wrote a while back, I think before the invasion, that he said the Arab states have been unable to deter Israeli aggression, occupation, repression, takeover of lands, and so on. They just haven't been able to deter it. As a result, non-state forces have developed, paramilitary and other non-state forces have developed to defend the population. One of them is Hamas, another one is Hezbollah. They've developed in response to the inability of the states to deter, he was too polite to say U.S., but I'll add it, U.S.-Israeli aggression, repression, takeover of lands, resources, and so on. So they developed, and he says, yeah, it's a dangerous situation. You don't want to have non-state actors inside a state, especially military ones, but that's what's going to happen. And unless the fundamental problems are dealt with, it's going to happen again. The U.S. and Israel substantially helped create Islamic fundamentalist extremism by destroying secular nationalism. Destroy secular nationalism, people aren't going to just say, okay, cut my throat. They're going to turn somewhere else. And the somewhere else, systematically, has been extremist religious fanaticism. Actually, there's something at a totally different level. There's something similar to that in the United States. So this shouldn't be too foreign to us. I mean, the last 25 years, which according to press and intellectual commentators has been a golden age, has been probably the worst period in American economic history for the general population. For 25 years, for the majority, the real wages have stagnated or declined. The working hours are going up. Benefits are declining. Services are declining. That's pretty unusual. It's never happened before. No depression, no major war. It's just economic policies have been designed that way. Well, associated with it is an increase in the role of religious fundamentalism in U.S. life. It's always been there. It's always been there as a big factor. But it's no secret to any of us that it's becoming more significant, partly because it's just being mobilized as a force for reaction, but partly because there's a response to the situation which is allowing it to be mobilized. It's a very familiar phenomenon. And when the United States and Israel have systematically destroyed secular nationalist movements in the Arab world, yeah, that's what you get in response. It goes way back. After all, remember that the U.S. since the Second World War, the U.S. has been the strongest outside supporter of extremist Islamic fundamentalism. I mean, Washington's oldest and most valued ally in the Arab world is Saudi Arabia. I mean, by comparison with Saudi Arabia, Iran looks like a democratic heaven. The threat to Saudi Arabian religious extremist tyranny was secular nationalism, mainly Nasser, centered around Nasser. So Nasser became an enemy because he was threatening the U.S. base of extremist religious fundamentalism, which happens to control the oil, which is the reason. And so yes, Israel performed a huge service to the United States in 1967 and to Saudi Arabia and the energy corporations by essentially eliminating secular Arab nationalism, which was regarded as a threat for good reasons. It was threatening to use the resources of the region for the needs of its own population. And that's intolerable. They're our resources, as George Kennan said a long time ago, and we have to protect them. And then the same's happened time after time. I mean, Israel created Hamas by destroying secular PLO, which was calling for negotiations and settlement, which Israel didn't want, the U.S. didn't want. So, okay, they destroyed it, and then what happens? Population doesn't disintegrate. It turned to something else. But what it turned to is religious fundamentalism. Well, the jihadi movement existed in the 70s. They killed Sadat. They're mainly Egyptian-based.
That took 14
the U.S.
minutes,
mobilized them.
30 seconds, including brush cleaning
by
time.
organizing them to
So I think
fight the Russians.
if I mix my paint quickly,
the Afghans
I might be able to knock out
But it was a good way to
Dogman
harm the
as
Cold
well.
War enemies. So they created the jihadis.
At least the
radical Now, they were there, as I said.
He's going to be a very pale blue.
Them, and that just continued step by step. I mean, in Pakistan,
It's around.
there's a major center now for...
All right, 12 minutes though, so I got to...
Comes from Ziel, who was strongly supported by the Reagan administration. In fact, for years, all through its tenure, the Reagan administration pretended that he wasn't developing nuclear weapons. Of course, they knew he was, but every year they'd religiously certify Pakistan as not developing nuclear weapons because they wanted to support their radical extremist fundamentalist friend. They knew perfectly well that Saudi Arabia was funding extremist madrasas, schools that would undermine the Lebanese educational system, Pakistani educational system, which had been pretty good. And people like Pervez Hoodboy, good friend of both of us, is a nuclear physicist, is deploring the fact that he can't get students anymore to study the sciences because all they're learning in school is, the Quran. They don't want to do science. That wasn't true in the past. Well, that's supported by the Reagan administration. Guys are in office right now. Just like they supported Saddam Hussein. I mean, he happened to be a secular maniac. They supported him too. I mean, they're ecumenical. They'll support anyone who accords with U.S. policies. When Saddam Hussein was invading Iran, that U.S. favored that, so therefore big supporters of Saddam Hussein, in fact, pretty much won the war for him. And same, it's all over the world. I mean, I don't know if you want to go through the rest, but...
We'll talk about Hezbollah being a Shia formation and its co-religionists in Iraq and Iran. And I just want to point out on August 4th, there was a massive rally in Baghdad where hundreds of thousands of Iraqis turned out chanting death to Israel and death to America.
Yeah. I mean, they have to give Rumsfeld and Cheney and Wolfowitz credit. They created a Shiite state in Iraq, which has close links to Iran, and may turn out to be another religious fundamentalist state. They created, wasn't there before. Whatever they thought they were doing, that's what they created. Yes, in fact, the parliament passed, I think, a unanimous resolution or something close to that, condemning the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And the Prime Minister, of course, made a strong statement condemning the invasion. He got a lot of flack about that when he came to the United States. Some Democratic congressional representatives boycotted him because he dared to condemn a U.S.-Israeli invasion of another country. You're not allowed to do that. For a liberal Democrat, that's outrageous. But sure, that's their position. And it's the position of the mass of the population all over the Arab world. I mean, even you read the New York Times reports. I mean, they do report that the tyrannies that run the countries criticize Hezbollah, but they also point out that that was in open defiance of their own populations. And in fact, they've had to back down. Like King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia is very much worried about Iran, and the Shiite movements, nevertheless, was compelled by popular opinion, and that's a tyranny. So, you don't just listen to the public unless it becomes dangerous. It was compelled to say that if this aggression continues, Saudi Arabia will have to react to a criminal invasion.
The relentless carnage and mayhem in Iraq, the deaths are in the thousands now. Internal refugees, de facto partition has even driven a big supporter of the war, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, to back off from his support. Where do you see U.S. policy in Iraq going?
Well, they have a real dilemma. All the talk about withdrawal strategies is essentially worthless unless it faces a fundamental point. The U.S. cannot withdraw from Iraq. It cannot leave Iraq as a sovereign, independent state. I mean, cannot is strong. It'd be an immense defeat. This is nothing like Vietnam. The analogies are worthless. In the case of Vietnam, they could destroy the country and walk out, basically win the war. Those are their major objectives. They get the maximal ones. They got the main objectives. You can't do that in Iraq. It's much too valuable. not only in itself, the second largest oil reserves in the world and very accessible ones, but it's positioned right in the center of the energy-producing regions, right next door to Iran and Saudi Arabia. You can't leave it to it would be like a nightmare for them to leave it to its own population, which would of course have a Shiite majority and would link up, tighten the relations with Iran as it's already doing. And there's more to it. I mean, right across the, by a strange accident of geography, the major energy reserves of the world happen to be in Shiite-dominated areas. So Saudi Arabia is the major energy reserves. They're mostly right there on the border of Iraq, which is some majority, but certainly a very large Shiite population, which has been bitterly repressed by the U.S.-backed tyranny, and is being spurred to move for greater rights, maybe even autonomy or something, by the fact that the Iraqi Shiites are now gaining some degree of control over policy. So you have the possibility of a kind of a loose Shiite alliance, including Shiite Iran, mostly Shiite Iran, Shiite Iraq, Shiite corner of Saudi Arabia, independent of Washington, controlling most of the world's energy. I mean, as if that wasn't bad enough, they may well turn to the east. The United States can intimidate Europe when they back off, but they can't intimidate China, which is one of the reasons for the fear of China. Just won't be intimidated. Been around for 3,000 years. Contempt for barbarians.
Did that and
proceed.
Not too long.
The U.S. tells them to back
Just
off.
in time to feed the cat before she goes completely crazy.
President Hu.
Alright, well that's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House in Mexico, working on oil painting alchemical light, setting the auras in for the mermaid and Dogman. Both of them turned out okay. May need to reinforce both colors again with another coat and blend them out so they're slightly larger. I don't know, I'll study it. That's not bad for the moment though. So have a good night, Earth. Thanks for watching.
Saudi Arabia's leading trading partners, providing them even